Hello and welcome everyone to a video that I've been looking forward to for a really long time. This is my top 10 favourite self-published fantasy books. So although I've been looking forward to this video for quite some time, I've also been putting it off for just as long. Part of that is because I've read quite a few self-published books over the course of the last couple of years, and the vast majority of them have been really good and could potentially make it into this video. There's also a good handful of self-published books that I haven't yet read, but I want to, and that I imagine could force their way into this list in the future. But you've got to start somewhere, and a favourites list can always be revisited. So I'm going to go through a couple of honourable mentions today, then my top 10 list, and then I'll aim to come back and amend this list in a year's time and have an annual series like some of my other top 10 videos where any new entries or movements in the list will be discussed. So two quick notes on the criteria for inclusion within this list. As far as self-published goes, I use the definition given by Mark Lawrence in his SPFBO competition, which is words to the effect of a book is self-published if the author has published that book themselves, or if it's published by a company that the author owns. Secondly, although an author is eligible to appear twice in this list, I will only include one book per series. Now, some of the books that I'll go through today are definitely kind of rooted in their position, and there are some which will move around, and tomorrow I might have a slightly different looking list to the one I've got today. But I've spent a good amount of time over it, and I've decided enough is enough. So here are the books that didn't make the list first of all, and then following that I'll go into the top 10. So the first of my honourable mentions is The Luck of the King by Tom Dumbrell. This is book one in his trilogy Pillars of Peace, which is now complete and available for you to go out and binge. I liked this as something a little bit different to your typical fantasy story. Magic and fantastic beasts do not really play a part in here at all. It's more about the characters and the story itself, but it's a really enjoyable read. And it's a really quick read as well. It's only a couple of hundred pages, so it's a really nice and easy starting point to the series. The second of my honourable mentions is Cold from the North by D.W. Ross. This is a really good story about a group of people who are fleeing their homeland after it's been invaded, and they get caught up in a prophecy and everything that entails. But some really good battles, some good magic, some great friendships in here, and overall it's a really enjoyable story. And then my last honourable mention is one that I ummed and ahed for a long time, going back and forth between this and number 10 on my list to see which one I would include. But the one that didn't make the cut is Burn Red Skies by Kirsten Espinosa Rosero. This was definitely an enjoyable read, as it should be if it's going to be close to making my top 10 in this list. I really enjoyed the magic in here. It's kind of an elemental magic. Everyone seems to have a degree of this magic. The dragons don't necessarily play as big a part as I was maybe led to believe by the cover and the synopsis and the title and so forth. But overall, I really had a good time with this one, and I'm looking forward to continuing my way through this series. Okay, so into my top 10 proper, and I'm going to try and be careful with a couple of these because I think three of the titles that I'm going to show you are very shiny, so I'll do what I can to show off the covers nicely for you. But number 10 in my list of my favourite self-published fantasy books is The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wang. This is one of the earlier self-published fantasy books that I read, certainly after I really started reading them in earnest. I had a great time with this one. It's another one that's got some really good elemental magic in it, and the story itself is in parts really heartbreaking. I loved the storytelling and the way that it wasn't afraid to do a couple of the things that it did without spoilers, and it was a very different seeming story for that. I thought it worked really well. One of the reasons it's not higher up my list, other than the quality of the books above it, is because there were also a few things in here that I didn't like. There were some flashbacks to essentially some urban fantasy style scenes or memories, and I really didn't like them because that's not my cup of tea. The other parts of the book definitely made up for it, but those flashbacks were a bit of a letdown for me. Overall, I would definitely recommend this one. It's quite a nice kind of entryway into fantasy as well, because although it does have that elemental magic, I don't think it's too heavy on all of the fantastical elements. Either way, The Sword of Kaigan by Emma Wang is a great self-published fantasy book. Number 9 on my list is one of the titles that I don't have a physical copy of it, but it is Empire of Shadows by Alicia Wonstelberg. This one is book 3, the final book in her Karaidec sagas, and as a final book in the series, I really enjoyed this one. This series for me is one that just got better and better with each book. So the first book I quite enjoyed, the second book I definitely enjoyed a lot more, and then this third book for me was really great. I loved the way that it pulled everything together and gave a really nice satisfactory conclusion to the series. The magic in here was really good. Building up through those first 2 books, you got little snippets of it, you started learning more and more, pretty much as the characters learn more, but in this third book it all comes to a head and you start to see not only the kind of origins of some of the magical beings in this story, but the devastation that the magic can cause as well. I really enjoyed this series as a whole, but this third book was definitely the icing on the cake. Number 8 on my list is another very shiny cover, and this one is The Seventh Cadence by Jim Wilborn. Now this one really started to get noticed because of this glorious cover that is on the front, and I love how this is actually a scene that you do read about in the book as well. Again, this is a story with lots of magic. You've got war in here, you've got secrets that some people are trying to keep while others are trying to eradicate. And I love again the way that all of the individual threads in this one start pulling themselves together at various points in the book. There's some really good characters and relationships in here, and it's one that I'm looking forward to continuing and seeing how they develop as the series goes on. There's some really nice and surprising elements in here as well, and I like the way that with the characters there's a couple that you kind of see as incidental characters, but they do gradually start to become main characters in their own right, and that was a bit of a surprise for me because I thought it was a really nice way of introducing a new main character rather than just having them appear out of nowhere. They were slowly introduced at first and then built up as the novel went on, and I really appreciated that. The storytelling overall is really good in here, and I can't wait to see where it goes next. Number 7 on my list is A Touch of Light by Thiago Abdallah. This is one of the books that I read this year and had a good time with overall, although I have to say, and I do so every time I mention this book pretty much, I have definitely appreciated it more with a little bit of distance from it. I wasn't very well when I originally read this, and I didn't have the best experience in that respect. But so much of this book has stayed with me, and that of course is a sign of a really good story. I love so many of the elements in here, but some of the fight scenes that we had, especially involving griffins and sentinels and huge armies that I won't go into detail of for fear of spoiling it for you, I thought was so well done, so well described, which made it so easy for me to picture them in my head, and those battles were epic. So it was really well done. There were a few bits in here that I wasn't as keen on, but the overall story really did help it to pull together. One thing I would say about A Touch of Light, there is a new novella which is a prequel set a little bit before events in this story. If you get the opportunity, I would recommend reading that first, because I think it will enhance the experience that you get when reading about some of the characters involved in that novella. But overall, this is a high recommendation. Number 6 on my list is Stones of Light by Zach Argyle. This is book 2 in his trilogy Threadlight, and I'm really hoping that on next year's list this book will not appear because I will have Bonds of Chaos, which is due to be released this August. That remains to be seen though, but in the meantime, Stones of Light is my favourite Zach Argyle book. I had such a great time with both of the books in Threadlight, and it's a really unique world. A lot of people do like to make comparisons between Threadlight and another well-known series because of the magic system, but there's no comparison. Both of them are unique individual magic systems. They just have some similarities, but I really loved it, and it's definitely one of the main things that made me enjoy the Threadlight series. The possibilities that the Threadweavers have for things they can and can't do is really interesting, and it makes for some fantastic scenes as you're looking at what they can do and how they can utilize their powers, whether it's in battle or escape and evasion or whatever it is. I really had a good time reading it. It was all really well portrayed on the page. Even better than the magic system in this book though is the characters and the relationships. There's some of the most realistic relationships between family members that I can remember seeing in a fantasy story, and that is what really made this series stand out for me. The writing, the story and the individual characters on their own were all top notch, but the magic system really helped to elevate it, and those family relationships added on top of that were just absolutely incredible. Into the back half of my list, and number 5 is Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson. This for me has got one of the most famous prologues in fantasy, or at least in self-published fantasy. I cannot think of one that I've heard people talk about as much as the prologue in Illborn. That says a lot, but it does set the scene for the book overall, even if it takes a while for the rest of the book to get there. This is a story with 4 very different characters, all taking very different paths, but they will start to interweave as the story goes on, at least for the most part. You've got politics between families and between kingdoms, you've got raiding war bands, and you've got holy war in here as well, and some of the religious persecution that you have in here is really well done and really well represented in terms of the thoughts and the feelings of the characters as they're experiencing or hearing about it. This was one of my favourite books of 2021 overall, and I had such a fantastic time with it. The second book in the series is hopefully going to be released in 2022, and I cannot wait. Number 4 on my list is book 1 in The War Eternal by Rob J. Hayes. This is Along the Razor's Edge. This is in many ways a very different book to the rest of the titles in my list. It's probably the darkest book on the list, both in terms of theme and also in setting. And that makes for a very different kind of storytelling, I suppose, because most of the book is set deep underground in a prison called the Pit. This is a first-person story, so most of what you get to see is obviously through that character's eyes, and you get so well enveloped in the thoughts and feelings of this particular character that she really becomes part of you as you're reading it. I love the language that's used in here. It is very dark, it is very coarse, it is very realistic for the situation. And I listened to the audiobook for this as well, and the narration was absolutely top notch, especially with that coarse language being used. The inflection used and the emotion put into it just worked absolutely perfectly. It is a story with magic in it, but overall it's more about being cut off from the magic and the way that makes a magic user feel when they've had basically the source of their power taken away from them. And it's about how they try to achieve their goals without something that they would take for granted and rely on. It's a really great story overall, but that main character is the key component putting this book so high up on my list. Into my top 3, and at number 3 we have Dragon Mage by M.L. Spencer. This is a book that took me the longest time to get round to. It's a big chunky book, but it was absolutely worth the wait. I highly recommend this one. The storytelling was absolutely fantastic, but the characters really helped to drive that forward because of the relationships that they have and the way that they treat each other, because they are very, very different. The main character here is a bit of a misfit. People have described him as being autistic, although of course that's not mentioned in the story itself, but the way that's portrayed I think is really well done. With no experience of it myself to speak of, I could really see and feel the way that he is treated and the way that he feels about that. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was so well done. The story itself though, I really enjoyed, and of course it's got dragons in it as well, and I thought they were very well done. I love the magic in here and the way that it works, and although we've got kind of a magic school, it doesn't really take up a vast portion of the book. It's not really one of the key settings or the key components of the story itself, but I like how everything is integrated. And you can also read this as a standalone. I think it was originally perhaps intended to be a standalone, although there is a sequel now in the works as well. Number 2 on my list, my favourite self-published fantasy books, is The Iron Crown by L.L. McRae. Again, this is a story with dragons. The series is called The Dragon Spirits, and that's very descriptive of what we get here. It's a unique take on dragons that I really appreciated. I loved reading about how they coalesce out of the air, and you never really know what to expect because they're not just your average dragon. I like that they can kind of provide blessings for people, and that introduces magic or various kind of magical or fantastical abilities within the people, and I thought that was really well done throughout the story. Again, there's some great relationships in here, and I really appreciate actually how some of it is really understated. There are certain elements in this book that are not really touched upon too much. They're kind of there in the background, and you maybe miss them at first until they actually get specifically mentioned in the story, and then you can go back in your head and pick out the instances where you've actually heard about that before, and it was just so well written into the story that it all just seemed natural. The key part of it for me is a person who cannot feel. She cannot physically feel when she is being touched, when she is being hurt, when she is stepping on a stone that cuts through her feet, for instance. And I really enjoyed the portrayal of how the character lives with that and how the people around her help her manage it. It was one of my favourite kind of understated parts of this book, actually. I thought it was a really interesting addition. In the whole, the world itself is really interesting. We've got griffins in here as well, which I thought were done really well. And I also really enjoyed the Citrine Key, which is a prequel novella to this series, and how it integrates with this book almost seamlessly. So it's another one where I do recommend reading the prequel novella first before you get to this one. It will introduce you to some kind of Easter eggs within this story. You can obviously read this without having read the Citrine Key, but if it's there available to you, why not get the full experience and read them both? And number one in my list, my favourite self-published fantasy book that I have read so far is Of Darkness and Light by Ryan Cahill. Now, a lot of people I've seen mention that the first book in the series of Blood and Fire is maybe a little bit rough around the edges. I personally didn't see that. I was having too much of a good time reading it. But the general consensus is that everything improves in leaps and bounds in this book. For me, having already really enjoyed the first book and not really found too much wrong with it, I would still say that everything really improved in this book. It was just a big step up from what was already a really good read for me. I love the story that you get in here and the relationships, the different paths that the characters take throughout the story. There are some elements of the story that you can really sort of see the long-ranging effects of it, and you can start thinking about the different pathways that people are going to take and how they're going to converge further on into the series. I like that we start to get some new elements introduced in here as well, which really shows that the author and the series, they're there for the long haul. There's going to be a lot of pages for you to read by the time you get to the end of this series, and I am definitely here for it. The characters in here are some of my favourites that I've read recently. There's a good handful that I can list that I love hearing about. And on top of that, there's not really any of those characters who I don't want to be hearing about. So if we get a point of view chapter for a character, I know that I'm going to be having a good time anyway, rather than wishing that it would just be a short chapter so I could get back to one of my favourites. Again, this is a story with dragons in it, and I love the kind of background and the history that you have to this particular world. It makes it so expansive, and we explore a decent portion of it as well in this story, and it just shows how well it's all been put together, how well thought out it's all been beyond the actual words on the page. And I love that kind of planning, that preparation that you can see within the story. Overall, I think this was my favourite book of 2021, and I would say it's going to take something special to knock this one off the top spot. Will it still be here in next year's list? Will it be replaced by its follow-up of War and Ruin? Or will another author and another title take the crown? That remains to be seen. So that was my list of my top 10 favourite self-published fantasy books that I have read. Each one of these I absolutely adored. They are fantastic works of art. In the comments down below, let me know what you thought of my list and what some of your choices would have been. I'll hopefully see you in another video soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.